Page 191 continued. E. Love of nature. Still others may escape into nature. Zest for the beauties of the external world characterizes all romantic poetry. The romantics carry us away from the suffocating atmosphere of cities into the fresh and invigorating company of the out-of-doors world. They not only sing of the sensuous beauty of nature, but also see into the heart of things and reveal the soul that lies behind. F. Emphasis on the inherent dignity and the nobility of man. Love of nature leads by an easy transition to the love of those who live in her lap. The romantics have an instinct for the elemental simplicities of life. Their heart overflows with sympathy for the poor and the downtrodden. They glorify the innocence and simplicity of the common man. They try to see into the heart of man and understand human nature. They find the divine in man, plead for his emancipation from all bondage, and claim equal rights and liberties for the humblest. The romantic movement thus becomes a part of the general democratic movement. G. Romanticism is a revolt against all artificiality. It stands for simplicity in theme and treatment. Not only do the romantics treat the common man, they also use his language for their purposes. Thus Wordsworth raised his voice against the inane and artificial diction of the 18th century classics and advocated the use of the language of the common man for purposes of poetry. Indeed, he went to the extent of remarking that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and that of prose. H. Their interest in the past leads the romantics to experience with old meters and poetic forms. The 18th century had confined itself to the use only of one meter, that is the heroic couplet. With the coming of the romantics, there is a revival of a number of ancient meters. End of page number 191, now page number 192. The Spenserian stanza, the ballad meter, the blank verse, the lyric, the chord and the sonnet are all revived and they attain wild popularity. The revival of ancient meters is accompanied with a renewed interest in ancient English masters. Chaucer, Spenser, Milton, etc., who had suffered an eclipse during the 18th century, now again come into their own. They, and not Pope or Dryden, now become the chosen literary models of the poets. English Romanticism is thus both a revolt and a revival. It is a revolt against the 18th century traditions and conventions. It is a revival of ancient meters and ancient masters of poetry. Characteristics of the Romantic poetry. Break from set rules. The poetry of the Romantic revival is in direct contrast to the characteristics cultivated by 18th century neoclassical poets. In the 18th century, poetry was governed by a set rules and regulations. There were well chalked out lines of poetic composition, and any deviation from the beaten track was frowned upon by the mentors of poetic thought. The first thing that we have in poetry of the new age is the break from the thraldom of rules and regulations. The Romantic movement was marked and is always marked, says W. J. Long, by a long reaction and protest against the bondage of rule and custom. which in science and theology as well as in literature generally tend to fetter the free human spirit. Interest in country life. Poetry in the 18th century was concerned with clubs and coffee houses, drawing rooms, and the social and political life of London. It was essentially the poetry of town life. Nature had practically no place in classical poetry. In the poetry of the Romantic Revival, the interest of the poets was transferred from town to country life and from the artificial decorations of drawing rooms to natural beauty and the loveliness of nature. Nature began to have its own importance in the poetry of this age, and Wordsworth was the great poet who revealed the physical and the spiritual beauty of nature to those who could not see any harm in the wild flowers, who could not see any charm in the wild flowers, the green fields, and the chirping birds. Thus, in the poetry of the Romantic Revival, we have an added zest among poets to discard the glamours of an artificial life and turn to the elemental simplicities of the life lived in closer touch with the beauties and charm of nature. Presentation of common life. Romantic poets started taking interest in the lives of the common people, the shepherds and the cottagers, and left the gallant lords and gay butterflies of fashion to the care of novelists. A renewed interest in simple life marked the poetry of the poets of this age. A feeling of humanitarianism colored the poetry of Wordsworth, Shelley, and Byron. Thus, Romantic poetry was marked by intense human sympathy and a consequent understanding of the human heart. Love of liberty and freedom. In Romantic poetry, emphasis was laid on liberty and freedom of the individual. Romantic poets were rebels against tyranny and brutality exercised by tyrants and despots over human beings, crushed by poverty and smashed by inhuman laws. In the poetry of this age, we have a note of rebellion and a crusade against effete conventions, effete conventions and worn out traditions. Freedom is the breath in which the Romantic poets breathed freely. Escape to the Middle Ages. Some Romantic poets felt chafed with the tyranny, squalor, and ugliness of materialistic life of their age, and to avoid this life of uneasy restlessness, they sought through their poetry an escape from the carking cares and corroding anxieties of this world to a world of beauty and joy which their poetic imagination had pictured. In many ways, Romantic poetry proved to be a poetry of escape from the sorrows and sufferings of mundane life of their times to the Middle Ages, when they found enough beauty and joy to feed the waning flame of their souls. The essential elements of the Romantic spirit, says Walter Pater, are curiosity and the love of beauty, and it is as the accidental effect of these qualities only that it makes the Middle Ages, because in the overcharged atmosphere of the Middle Age there are unworked resources of romantic effect, of a strange beauty to be won by strong imagination out of things likely or remote. The enthusiasm for the Middle Ages satisfied the emotional sense of wonder on the one hand and the intellectual sense of curiosity on the other. Predominance of imagination and emotion. In romantic poetry, reason and intellect were subdued and their place was taken by imagination, emotion, and passion. In the poetry of all the romantic poets of this age, we have the exhibition of heightened emotional sensibilities and imaginative flights of genius bordering on empyrean heights unscaled by the poets of the previous age. End of page 192, now page 193. Supernaturalism. Supernaturalism is another outstanding quality of romantic poetry. A sense of wonder and mystery was imparted to poetry by poets like Coleridge and Scott. It was this supernatural note that gave to romantic poetry its atmosphere of wonder and mystery, uncanniness and eerie feeling, and justify the title "The Renaissance of Wonder" given to this poetic age by a critic of repute. Note of subjectivity. Subjectivity began to have its full play in the poetry of this age. The poets of this period were in favor of giving subjective interpretation to the objective realities of life. Romantic poetry became individualistic in outlook. The Romantic movement, says Long, was the expression of individual genius rather than of established rules, or as Lucas says, that it was an expression of id. Endless variety in the romantic poetry. In romantic poetry, we come across endless variety. Poetry of this age is as varied as the character and the moods of different writers. When we read Pope, for instance, we have a general impression of sameness, says Long. But in the work of the best romantics, there is endless variety. To read them is like passing through a new village, meeting a score of different human types and finding in each one something to love or to remember. Lyricism. In romantic poetry, lyricism predominates, and the poets of this school have to their credit a number of fine lyrics excelling the heroic couplet of the classical age in melody and sweetness of tone. Simplicity in style. The style of the romantic poets is varied. Greater stress is laid on simplicity instead of the inflated and artificial mode of expression adopted by the classical poets. In romantic poetry, we have a more natural diction and spontaneous way of expressing thoughts. Summing up the salient characteristics of the poetry of the Romantic Revival, we may say, in the words of W. J. Long, that the poetry of Romanticism is characterized by the protest against the bondage of rules, the return to nature and the human heart, the interest in old sagas and medieval romances as suggestive of a heroic age, the sympathy with the toilers of the world, the emphasis upon individual genius, and the return to Milton and the Elizabethans instead of to Pope and Dryden for literary models. Literary characteristics of the age. It is intensely interesting to note how literature at first reflected the political turmoil of the age, and then, when the turmoil was over and England began her mighty work of reform, how literature suddenly developed a new creative spirit which shows itself in the poetry of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and the prose of Scott, Jane Austen, Lamb, and De Quincey. A wonderful group of writers whose patriotic enthusiasm suggests the Elizabethan days and whose genius has caused their age to be known as the second creative period of our literature. Thus, in the early days, when old institutions seemed crumbling with the Bastille, Coleridge and Choudhury formed their youthful scheme of a pantisocracy on the banks of the Susquehanna, an ideal commonwealth in which the principles of More's utopia would be put in practice. Even Wordsworth, fired with political enthusiasm, could write, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." The essence of Romanticism was, it must be remembered, that the literature must reflect all that is spontaneous and unaffected in nature and in man, and be free to follow its own fancy in its own way. We have already noted this characteristic in the work of Elizabethan dramatists who followed their own genius in opposition to all the laws of the critics. In Coleridge, we see this independence expressed in Kublai Khan and the Ancient Mariner, two dream pictures, one of the populous Orient, the other of a lonely sea. In Wordsworth, this literary independence led him inward to the heart of common things, following his own instinct as Shakespeare does. He too finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. And so, more than any other writer of this age, he invests the common life of nature and the souls of common men and women with glorious significance. End of page 193, now page 194. These two poets, Coleridge and Wordsworth, best represent the romantic genius of the age in which they lived. Though Scott had a greater literary reputation, and Byron and Shelley had larger audiences. The second characteristic of this age is that it is emphatically an age of poetry. The previous century, with its practical outlook on life, was largely one of prose, but now, as in the Elizabethan age, the young enthusiasts turned as naturally to poetry as a happy man to singing. The glory of the age is in the poetry of Scott, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Moore, and Southey. Of its prose works, those of Scott alone have attained a very wide reading, though the essays of Charles Lamb and the novels of Jane Austen have slowly won for their authors a secure place in the history of our literature. Coleridge and Southey, who with Wordsworth formed the trio of the so-called lake poets, wrote far more prose than poetry, and Southey's prose is much better than his verse. It was characteristic of the spirit of this age, so different from our own, that Southey could say that in order to earn money he wrote in verse what would otherwise have been better written in prose. It was during this period that a woman assumed for the first time an important place in our literature. Probably the chief reason for this interesting phenomenon lies in the fact that woman was for the first time given some slight chance of education, of entering into the intellectual life of the race, and as is always the case when woman is given anything like a fair opportunity, she responded magnificently. A secondary reason may be found in the nature of the age itself, which was intensely emotional. The French Revolution stirred all Europe to its depths, and during the following half century, every great movement in literature, as in politics and religion, was characterized by strong emotion, which is all the more noticeable by contrast with the cold, formal, satiric spirit of the early 18th century. As woman is naturally more emotional than man, it may well be said that the spirit of this emotional age attracted her and gave her the opportunity to express herself in literature. As all strong emotions tend to extremes, the age produced a new type of novel which seems rather hysterical now, but which in its own way delighted multitudes of readers whose nerves were somewhat excited and who revelled in bogie stories of supernatural terror. Mrs. Anne Radcliffe, 1764 to 1823, was one of the most successful writers of this school of exaggerated romance. Her novels, with their azure-eyed heroines, haunted castles, trapdoors, bandits, abductions, rescues in the nick of time, and a general medley of overwrought joys and horrors, were immensely popular, not only with the crowd of novel readers, but also with men of unquestioned literary genius like Scott and Byron. In marked contrast to these extravagant stories is the enduring work of Jane Austen, with her charming descriptions of everyday life and of Maria Edgeworth, whose wonderful pictures of Irish life suggested to Walter Scott the idea of writing his Scottish romances. Two other women who attained a more or less lasting fame were Hannah More, poet, dramatist and novelist, and Jane Porter, whose Scottish Chiefs and Thaddeus of Warsaw are still in demand in our libraries. Besides these were Fanny Burney, Madame d'Arblay, and several other writers whose works in the early part of the 19th century raised a woman to the high place in literature which she has ever since maintained. In this age, literary criticism became firmly established by the appearance of such magazines as the Edinburgh Review, the Quarterly Review, Blackwood's Magazine, to the Westminster's Review, the Spectator, the Athenaeum, and Fraser's Magazine. These magazines, edited by such men as Francis Jeffrey, John Wilson, who is known to as Christopher North, and John Gibson Lockhart, who gave us the life of Scott, exercised all immense influence on all subsequent literature. At first, their criticism were largely destructive, as when Jeffrey hammered Scott, Wordsworth, and Byron most unmercifully, and Lockhart could find no good in either Keats or Tennyson. But with the added wisdom, criticism assured its true function of construction, and when these magazines began to seek and publish the works of unknown writers like Hazlitt, Lamb, and Leigh Hunt, they discovered the chief mission of the modern magazine, which is to give every writer of ability, the support, the opportunity to make his work known to the world. The generation of a new interest in the Middle Ages was one of the hallmarks of the Romantic movement in England, as in the rest of Europe. End of page 194. Now page 195. Heine went so far as to define Romanticism as the reawakening of the Middle Ages. H.A. Beers, in A History of England Romanticism, 1902, was also mainly concerned with the revival of medievalism. It is, however, too lopsided an interpretation of the Romanticism, which was in fact a very complex and composite phenomenon. Why were most Romantic poets interested in the Middle Ages? The answer to this question is not far to seek. The Romantics were essentially critical of intellectualism, sophisticated civilization, and bards. Why were most Romantic poets interested in the Middle Ages? The answer to this question is not far to seek. The Romantics were essentially critical of intellectualism, sophisticated civilization, and harsh, humdrum reality. The desire to get rid of them made them amorous of the far. They sought an escape into regions and states of being as far removed in time and space as possible. It is this love of the remote, the strange, and the mysterious which induced in them an interest in the Middle Ages. The Romantic poet is impatient of the real and the earthbound. He is often discontented with the state of things as they are. Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, and Scott are notably so. Being dissatisfied with oppressed realities, they either sing of the glorious past or project their imagination into the womb of futurity to raise a shape that answers their own desire. Thus Keats sings of the glory that was Greece. Scott endeavors to recapture the splendor of the past ages, particularly the Middle Ages. Shelley sings of the golden age to come, and Coleridge is lost in a world of his own making. Says Shelley, "We look before and after and pine for not what is not." Samuel C. Chew observes about the Romantics' interest in the Middle Ages. With such currents of thought and feeling flowing, it was natural that the Middle Ages were regarded with fresh sympathy, though not, be it said, with accurate understanding. It is true that there were those who, like Shelley, seeking to reshape the present in accordance with desire, did not revert to the past but pursued their ideal into an utopian future. But to others the Middle Ages offered a spiritual home, remote and vague and mysterious. The typical romanticist does not reconstruct the past from the substantial evidence provided by research, but fashions it anew, not as it was, but as it ought to have been. The more the writer insists upon the historical accuracy of his reconstruction, the less romantic is he. Thus, I am repeating, the more the writer insists upon the historical accuracy of his reconstruction, the less romantic is he. Thus, some romantics who love the Middle Ages not only tried to escape from the real and present world, but from the real medieval world too. They fashioned it anew as ought to have been, ignoring its unpalatable feature known to all historians. They glorify its splendor and chivalry and forget its dirt, disease, squalor, superstition, and social oppression. Pater's explanation as to what led most Romantic poets to make their spiritual home in the Middle Ages is explained by Walter Pater in the following words, quote, "The essential elements of the Romantic spirit are curiosity and the love of beauty, and it is as the accidental effect of these qualities only that it seeks the Middle Ages, because in the overcharged atmosphere of the Middle Ages there are unworked sources of romantic effect, of a strange beauty to be won by strong imagination out of things unlikely or remote." Romanticism is interpreted by Pater as the addition of the sense of strangeness to beauty. Strangeness implies the combination of the emotional sense of wonder and the intellectual sense of curiosity. Both these senses are gratified by the romance-clad, remote and mysterious Middle Ages. Not all Romantic poets are medievalists. In spite of the view of Heine and Beers already referred to, medievalism is not an essential feature of all Romantic poetry, even though it be one of the hallmark of the Romantic movement in England. Many important poets did not, for different reasons, evince much interest in the Middle Ages, but they were Romantics all the same. Among such poets must be mentioned the names of Wordsworth, Shelley, and Byron. Wordsworth found a constant spiritual anchor in nature. He was as keenly dissatisfied with the world of reality as any other Romantic poet, but whereas others escaped to the remote in time and space, Wordsworth found it in the healing power of nature, a balm for all its pains and all his pains and frustrations. Why should he have looked to the Middle Ages when the panacea for all his ills was present right in front of him? There is not any strong element of romantic agony and yearning in Wordsworth's poetry as nature led him from joy to joy. Medievalism for Wordsworth then was an utter irrelevancy. As regards Shelley, the absence of interest in the Middle Ages may be explained by his persistent futurism. End of page 195. Now page 196. He found his spiritual home not in the supposedly near ideal bygone ages, but in the golden age to come. He looked after, rather than before, the unborn tomorrow appealed to him as more real than the dead yesterday. He, however, did not love to dwell upon the mystery spirit or foreign lands and remote times. At any rate, the love of the Middle Ages does not manifest itself as a specific and noteworthy element. At any rate, the love of the Middle Ages does not manifest itself as a specific and noteworthy element in his poetry. Byron's temper and approach were in busy Byron's temper and approach were in many respects quite different from those of most romantic poets, but the love of the remote was equally shared by him and with others. However, he was much more interested in the Orient than in medieval Europe. His Oriental tales, the Giaour, the Bride of Abydos, and the Corsair, have for their background the world of Oriental romance. However, their interest resides not in the romantic atmosphere, but the personality of the hero in each case. Only in Lara 1814 do we find Byron employing a quote, Samuel Situ, the Gothic made for her the Gothic mode for the delineation of the Byronic hero. Thus, on the whole, Byron manifests little interest in medievalism.